Good morning. Thank you for coming to our lunchtime speaker series, which is titled Free Speech Wars, From Campus to Culture. And here it's really an honor for me. I have followed his career from afar and with admiration for many years, and I want to tell you a little bit about him before we sit down and have a conversation, which will then be followed by your questions. William Jacobson is a clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School. He graduated from Hamilton College with his undergraduate degree and Harvard International Law Journal, as well as director of litigation for the Harvard Prison Legal Assistance Project. Prior to joining the Cornell faculty in 2007, Professor Jacobson had a highly successful career in civil litigation and arbitration practice in Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Jacobson has argued cases in numerous federal as well as state courts. He has a national reputation as a leading practitioner in securities arbitration. He is frequently quoted in national media on issues related to investment fraud and investor protection. Professor Jacobson founded Legal Insurrection, the website Legal Insurrection, in 2008, and he is the president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation. He has also lectured extensively on issues of free speech on campus, the anti-Israel movement, and anti-Semitism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jacobson.
Thank you for those opening remarks. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for coming here. It's a real pleasure to have you. Tell the audience a little bit about your background before we get into the substantive questions about free speech.
Well, I grew up just outside of New York City, went to Hamilton College in upstate New York, a small school, then went on to Harvard Law School. At Hamilton, I was a Russian studies major. I studied in the Soviet Union in 1980. I did not see Bernie there. I was visiting with the dissidents while he was doing other things. And that was a very formative experience for me. And after Harvard Law School, I went on to private law practice in New York City for 9 years. Then my wife and I decided I couldn't take it anymore in New York City. Between the commuting and just the hassles. And we made a lifestyle decision, and like the Beverly Hillbillies, we loaded up our truck and sold our house, and we moved to Rhode Island, and it was the best thing I ever did. Was in Rhode Island for another 13 plus years practicing law. I was a plaintiff's securities contingency fee lawyer, and then I became very ill in 2006 and had to hang up my practice and close the law firm. And when I was trying to figure out what I would do, I thought of the phrase, those who can't do, teach. So I couldn't do, so I saw that Cornell was looking for somebody. I threw in a resume, and the next thing you know, I'm there.
Just for those in our audience who may not know, you mentioned not seeing presidential candidate Sanders in the Soviet Union in 1980. Yes. Would you want to tell them the rest?
He very famously has the photos where he was on some sort of solidarity mission or something like that. But when I was there, I actually was there 3 times, and mostly once through Hamilton and once through Middlebury College, where I studied Russian language. And I became very close with a lot of the refusnik families while I was in Moscow. Refusniks were Soviet Jews who had put in an application for a visa to emigrate to Israel and were refused. And when they were refused, they would lose their jobs. And so when I went over there, I became very close with a couple of the most prominent refusnik families and spent a lot of time with them. And you know, if it means anything to anybody, Yakir family was one of the families that I was very close with in Moscow. Fast forward 30 years later, I hadn't seen them in 30 years, and my wife and I found them in Israel, and we visited them in Israel, and that was very moving to see how they'd made that long journey to there. So my Soviet Union experience was extremely formative. It was, you know, I realized if you talk about the oppressive power of the state, and it's unfortunate that kids nowadays think that's cool, think that, you know, hammer and sickle is cool, but those who, I didn't live under it, but I witnessed it firsthand, realized what oppression really is.
You've been teaching at Cornell for 12 years now. What is it like being a conservative on the Cornell campus?
Very lonely. They don't call, they don't write. And when they do call and they do write, it's not the greatest. So it is actually interesting because Cornell, Ithaca campus, I think the student body is somewhere in the 17,000, maybe 20,000 range. I think the faculty is approaching, or people who have a designation as faculty, 2,000. And you can count on one hand the number of openly conservative professors on campus. And on that one hand, you can count one finger for the only person who's as out there as I am. And so it's been a very interesting experience. When I was hired at Cornell, I was completely non-political. I really became political in 2008, right around the time of the 2008 election. Query whether they would have hired me if I had the website before then. I don't think I would have been hired. But once I was there, what are they going to do? But it's been a very interesting experience because almost from the day I started the website, a lot of external pressure to get me fired. The emails and letters to the university complaining about me and saying what a horror it was that I was on the faculty, threats to boycott the school if I wasn't fired, harassment of other faculty, started within 2 to 3 weeks of me starting my website. And so it's really been an experience. I will say to Cornell's credit, the deans at the law school, both the one who hired me and the current dean, have always been completely supportive. They have said, don't worry about it. But there have been some pretty intense times where, and the interesting thing is that the people doing this, to my knowledge, were always off campus. And they were not anarchists, they were not communists, they were mainstream Obama liberals who felt it was their right to get me fired for espousing what are fairly mainstream, right-of-center opinions on things. So it's been a very interesting experience, but it is a lonely experience. The Cornell Sun did a survey, not a survey, they did research. I think it was 96 or 97% of faculty donations went to Democrats, and that's reflective of the fact that I am one of a handful of people on the campus. Now, there may be other professors who might think of themselves as conservative. They may have economic ideas that we would call conservative, but they don't put themselves out there politically because there's a price to be paid. It hasn't resulted in my firing, but it's not pleasant. I don't pick up my office phone. I do not pick it up unless I know who's calling. And my staff is under strict instructions never to let anybody know where I am, whether I'm in Ithaca or cell phone numbers or anything like that. It's just what you live with.
That leads me to my next question, which is, why did you decide to start Legal Insurrection?
As I mentioned, I was never political, or I shouldn't say I hadn't been political since law school in early 1980s. And I was practicing law, too busy. When I moved to Rhode Island, I had a little more time, but it's the most democratic state in the country, and it just wasn't worth it for me to get involved in politics, appearing in court in front of judges. It just wasn't something I really wanted to do. Got hired at Cornell, and I think, like a lot of people, 2008 was something of a transformative year. So I'm getting more and more frustrated with the media bias, media meddling in our election, if you want to put it that way. But it kept my mouth shut. Then in late August 2008, I'm having dinner with a former client, somebody I had won a lot of money for, And we'd become quite close, as couples as well, but we'd never spoken about politics. And at dinner, he asked me, well, who are you voting for? And I said, I'm voting for John McCain and Sarah Palin. And then we got into about a 45-minute to hour-long argument over politics. And at the end of it, he said, I've never heard anybody explain as clearly as you do your side. You should start a blog. I had no idea what a blog was. Dummy me took up the challenge. So I went to Google Blogger, and it was free, so that's good. Very simple. I picked the simplest template I could find there. Then I needed to come up with a name, so I said, word association. How am I feeling? The word insurrection came to mind. That's the way I was feeling. And then I looked it up, and an insurrection, by definition, is illegal. So I said, it's probably not a great idea, so let's call it legal insurrection, which is a contradiction in terms. And that's how I got the name. None of this was planned. None of it was thought out. I was so naive, I didn't even know you could use a pseudonym to write on the internet. So I used my real name, which was the best choice I ever made, because I don't think people take you seriously unless you're willing to put yourself out there. But I didn't think that through. I just used my real name. And as I mentioned, my first post was October 12th, 2008. So we just had our 11th anniversary a couple of days ago. And by the end of October, the emails were coming in demanding I be fired. It was shocking to me at first, because I'm not saying, I'm pure as the driven snow and I don't use profanity, but what people would put in emails was really shocking to me. And it just went on from there. And that's how I started it. And it was me alone for 2 years. Then it was me and a student from the Cornell Republicans, because I'm their faculty advisor. I'm basically the faculty advisor to almost every non-liberal group on campus. And that's not a joke. She wrote for me. So for the third year, it was just me and a student. And then we got a little bit more organized, and the website's developed over the years. And now we've started a research foundation. And it's been an interesting ride. I always try to remind people, this isn't actually my job. Okay, I do this in my spare time, even though it's how I've become known to most people. It's not actually my job. It's been an interesting trip. I wouldn't change anything, but putting yourself out there has interesting aspects to it.
Would you describe for the audience the tack that legal insurrection takes in covering campus free speech and other issues?
Yes, we've gone through some iterations over the years. We used to have a website called College Insurrection, which we ended up folding into legal insurrection because we couldn't develop an audience independent of legal insurrection. And that's more of an aggregator. And so we still have that. We just aggregate stories from other places about what's happening. But we also do very in-depth coverage. Some of you might be familiar with what we did on the Oberlin College Gibsons bakery case. And we've done that on many different issues. We've litigated FOIA cases to get school records with regard to the anti-Israel movement in public schools. We've sent people to campuses. We generally, our mode of operation is when we seize on an issue, we don't let go of it. And we cover it in much more depth than anybody else, as was evidenced by Oberlin College. And that's a perfect example. We've covered numerous controversies at Oberlin over the years, which is why I was so attuned when this bakery boycott happened and bakery protests, because that was about the 5th time we've covered something like that at Oberlin. And so we just latched onto it. We never let go. We were the only national media outlet with the reporter in the courtroom every single day at great expense to us. And it paid off for us, because when the verdict finally came down, we were the only one who had been covering it. And so but that's just typical of what we do. And we try to, particularly in the early years of the website, we acted as something of a first responder with regard to pro-Israel groups on campus before a lot of the bigger organizations got involved. So when the American Studies Association passed the academic boycott of Israel in December of 2013, we organized a reader effort to reach out to university presidents to obtain statements condemning the boycott as against academic freedom. And we started that ball rolling through a reader outreach. It got to the point, once we'd gotten 20 or 30, then big groups got involved. And then we ran it up to 250 university presidents who condemned the academic boycott passed by the American Studies. And that was through our website, because we had an interested and active reader. And those are the sort of things we do on campus. We try not just to cover what I'll call the, college student says something stupid media sort of thing. We try to get deeper into it and try to have a bigger impact when we can.
You mentioned the Oberlin case. For those in the audience who don't know about it, would you talk about the facts of the case and your involvement?
Sure. Well, so the day after Donald Trump was elected, and I think that's important that it happened on that day, Oberlin College, as many college campuses, was in meltdown. That afternoon, a black Oberlin College male student was stopped for shoplifting at Gibsons Bakery and Market. Been in existence for 130 years. The person was, in fact, shoplifting. That's been proven. He later pleaded guilty to it. But a scuffle ensued, and two other black Oberlin College students were involved in the scuffle. They were all arrested. Because you had a white store owner and 3 black students, it was immediately on campus portrayed as a case of racial profiling. Nobody waited for the facts to come in, that they actually were shoplifting, and they swung into action, and the entire college community launched a campaign to boycott this little bakery in town, to accuse them of racial profiling. And there were protests outside the store, and significantly for what would develop in the legal case, the dean of students of the college was outside, and she disputes it, but there were witnesses, and that's why you have a jury trial and a jury resolves it. But there were witnesses who described her as leading the protest with a bullhorn and passing out stacks of flyers, which ended up giving rise to the defamation case against the college. So the defamation case was that the dean of students, a senior vice president of the entity, was passing out defamatory flyers. Went to trial. Oberlin College's defense was completely tone deaf. They just attacked this little bakery. And the jury came down with an $11 million compensatory verdict, which if you'd been reading our website, you would have seen coming. We certainly couldn't predict a dollar amount, and jury verdicts are always uncertain, but each day we would report on the testimony, and it was just a dumpster fire for the college. Horrible internal text messages and emails came out about their attitude towards the bakery, and it really, so when the $11 million came in, now the media starts to pay attention to it. Then they moved in, it's bifurcated, because in Ohio, under Republican tort reform, you have a bifurcated trial for compensatory and punitive. So they went to the punitive phase, and then a $33 million punitive verdict came down. Those were reduced, the combined 44. Irony of ironies. Ultra-liberal Oberlin got the benefit of Republican tort reform, and those were knocked down from 44 under tort reform caps to 25 million, still significant. And that is the case, and it just really came to epitomize for a lot of people the dismissive, arrogant attitude that some college administrators have towards the community, and have towards people who are perceived as being, and the Gibsons actually are Democrats. I mean, they're not conservatives, but kind of identity politics on campus trumped everything, including the facts. And I do believe that had it happened on a day other than the day after Donald Trump was elected, maybe we wouldn't be here today.
Are there any other lessons that we can draw from the Gibson family's response to Oberlin College?
It was a very tough fight for them, and unfortunately, David Gibson, who was involved in this, So there are three Gibsons. There's the grandfather, who's roughly 90. There's David, who I believe is in his late 60s. And then the younger Gibson, who was the store clerk that day, who stopped the shoplifters. David Gibson, they just announced, has pancreatic cancer and is in the hospital and probably isn't going to make it. But they had a very tough fight. Oberlin fought this tooth and nail. Oberlin College's legal fees, because it came out in the post-trial phase, because Gibson's also got legal fees awarded to them. Oberlin College's legal fees were $5 million. They fought this as bitterly and as vigorously as any corporation would fight any lawsuit. And the plaintiff's lawyer's time was also about $5 million into it. This was a very hard-fought case. The college fought every single thing, motion after motion after motion, even post-trial motions. And it was really, and so what is the lesson? The lesson is, one, it's not easy to go up against a large corporation, and universities are large corporations. And or at least at the administrative level, they're large corporations, and they have the resources to defend themselves. Probably insurance was paying for the defense, although I don't know that insurance will pay for the verdict. There's difference. Insurers have to defend, sometimes even if they're going to disclaim coverage. So this was paid for probably by the insurance companies. They were never able to negotiate a settlement. And I think it's very tough. If it weren't for plaintiffs' contingency fee lawyers representing the Gibsons, they never could have fought this thing. And so, you know, the lesson is it is possible to stand up, but it's very tough. And nobody should think that just because the Gibsons won this case, every aggrieved person on a university campus is going to have an easy time of it, because that's not what happened here. And I think that the college is trying to portray themselves as the victim and trying to portray themselves as the protector of student speech. And what they did as soon as the trial was over, they mounted a publicity campaign which said that they were held liable for student speech. This case sets a precedent, because if universities are held liable for student speech, then universities will feel compelled to suppress student speech. But that is not, in fact, what the college was held liable for. The jury instructions are very clear. The claims are very clear. They were held liable because one of their senior officers allegedly was passing out defamatory statements and interfering in the bakery's business. And just like any other corporation, if you have an officer acting within the scope of their employment and they commit a tort, the corporation's potentially liable. That's all this is. This is plain vanilla corporate and defamation law, but Oberlin College appears to have convinced a significant part of the higher education industry that this is a threat to free speech on campus, and I don't believe it is if anybody understands it.
On the Legal Insurrection website, you use the term cancel culture as well as call-out culture. Would you explain what that means?
Yes, those are terms that have come into play a lot in the last couple of years. Call-out culture, cancel culture. And what it is some of what I experienced starting my website, that there are people out there who feel they have the right to call me out, and they do. They're entitled to their opinion just like I am. But when it's done in such a way that voicing certain opinions on campus carries a heavy price to it, it has the effect of stifling speech on campus. And a lot of students express that to me, that they just do a cost-benefit analysis, and it is not worth it for them to tangle on some policy issues. Do you like Obamacare or not? Okay, if disagreeing with Obamacare is going to get you labeled a racist, then falsely labeled a racist, then a lot of people and students go through the equation, say it's not worth it for me to put myself out there. And then there's cancel culture, which is things like trying to get me fired. I had another experience at Vassar College. So I gave a speech at Vassar College in It's about an hour north of New York City. It's similar to Oberlin, a very liberal sort of college. I was invited by the Vassar Conservative Libertarian Student Union, which was all of about 9 students on a campus of 2,000. And they came, they invited me to talk about the concept of hate speech and how hate speech is protected speech under the First Amendment. There's no such thing as hate speech as a matter of law. And so we titled the speech, "Hate Speech is Still Free Speech, Even After Charlottesville." Because my concern would be that, as horrific as what happened in Charlottesville was, that it would be used as an excuse by people who were already inclined to stifle right of center speech. And what happened in Charlottesville was not right of center, it was criminal. And so I felt it was important to go over with students. And I went to Vassar because I'd spoken there several years earlier against the academic boycott of Israel. And so as soon as the posters went up for my speech, the entire campus melted down. They organized 2 campus-wide forums to address how they were going to deal with me coming to campus. They spread rumors in email that I was a white supremacist, bringing my white nationalist supporters to campus to target people of color. Complete fabrication. They organized safety committees for me coming. The student government, and here's the cancel culture, the student government executive board demanded the president cancel my speech, cancel my appearance. And as a lawyer, one of the great lines I've ever seen in their letter was, they said, "We demand that you breach the contract for him to appear on campus." To her credit, she didn't, I think she could have done a better job, but she didn't cancel my appearance. I had to be escorted onto campus. It was really an outer body experience, which I'm not the only one to go through this, where they're talking about this person, and after a while you realize that's you they're talking about, and it bears no resemblance to you. And so I got escorted on. They not only had the safety teams, they had safe spaces, and they had teams to guide people to safe spaces with glow sticks in case they couldn't find them. And the library was one of the safe spaces, and I kid you not, they had coloring books for college students who felt triggered by me being on campus. The end result of this was actually good. My speech probably would have gotten 20 people, the 9 students in the Conservative Libertarian Union and their friends. Instead, we had almost 300 people. The largest lecture hall on the campus was overflowing into the hallways. 45-minute speech, which was a basic civics lesson on what free speech means, why historically it is actually, those protections have benefited the left more than the right in this country. The civil rights movement could never have taken place without the protection of the First Amendment. I went through the Bill of Rights with them and how none of them are willing to give up on campus, even though the Bill of Rights doesn't technically apply to what the college does, it's a private institution. But I said, who here wants the administration to be able to search you just because they want to? Who here wants them to be able to take your stuff without due process to dispute it? And nobody, I said, why is it the only right you are eager to give up on campus is your free speech rights? And we went through this, 45-minute lecture, hour and 15-minute question and answer. No interruptions, even though about 50 students had shown up in the hall dressed like Antifa with the black and the black masks and everything, intending. The second I started speaking, they realized I wasn't this monster I'd been portrayed to be. They all listened, they asked questions, and one thing I realized from that was there is a hunger on college campuses for an alternative education, alternative to what they're getting. There is a hunger among these students to be taught about history, the actual history, not the politicized history that they're hearing, to be taught about the Bill of Rights, to be taught about constitutional principles. And I received a number of emails afterwards from students who apologized for the way I was treated. And it really, and they told me that it had a huge impact on campus because they realized that their student leaders, who were activists, had lied to them about who was coming to campus and what the talk was about. And so that's cancel culture. I mean, numerous conservative speakers have experienced it. There's some famous cases. I mean, Ben Shapiro's always they're trying to cancel him directly or indirectly. The tactics some universities are using are security fees. And so at Cornell, we had an experience, I don't know if you know the name Michael Johns. He was one of the original Tea Party founders, Tea Party movement people, and his son is a student at Cornell. And they invited him to speak on campus, and he wasn't even invited by the Cornell Republicans. He was invited by the Cornell Political Union, which is a nonpartisan group that sponsors debates on policy topics. And he was going to debate people on something related to Trump. And university police picked up chatter on Facebook that there were planned disruptions of the event. And so rather than providing the protection needed to avoid a disruption, they went to the Cornell Political Union and said, you have to give us $2,000 for police protection, or you have to turn this private and move it to an undisclosed location. They said, well, we don't have $2,000. And so they had to move it to an undisclosed location, which obviously limited access that people had. And even then, they were found out and students protested and banged on the doors and things like that. That's camp. I mean, I could give you a dozen or 2 dozen, but we don't have all day here. This is what's happening on campuses, an intolerance for differing opinions that, you know, they say they want to ban the Nazis from campus, and everybody says, well, okay, nobody wants Nazis on campus. But then they redefine Nazis to be everybody who's right of censor. Okay, and so that's what's happened on a lot of college campuses. I think there is some pushback to that. Cornell has revised its security fees. They no longer will apply it merely because there's a controversial speaker. It was like a controversial speaker fee, because who's going to be controversial on Cornell campus? Somebody like Michael Johns. I mean, Cornell every year has a communist conference on campus. Not liberal, communist conference. Nobody interrupts it, nobody interferes with it, nobody protests it. They don't need to pay their controversial speaker security fee. And so I think there's pushback, and I think some other universities around the country are coming under pressure to revise those security fees, because otherwise you're just rewarding the heckler's veto by means of a security fee. And that's the call out and the cancel culture. And you know, I think a lot of the problems I see on campus are cultural problems among the student body, obviously influenced by faculty, obviously influenced by administrators, but students feel under a lot of peer pressure to conform to the liberal party line.
Let's stay on hate speech for a minute here, because I talk to young people all the time about this, and a lot of young people and some not so young people think that there is, or at least should be, a hate speech exception to the First Amendment. And in addition, a good number of them think that what you just called the heckler's veto or the shout down, that is as legitimate an exercise of the First Amendment as is giving a speech and being allowed to hear it. Would you address both those points?
Yes, and that's something I spoke to the students at Vassar about, that your right to free speech. Yes, you do have the right to express disagreement with the speaker, but you don't have the right to prevent the speaker from speaking, and you don't have the right to prevent others from listening. And there's not necessarily a bright line. There are some obvious cases. If you take over the stage and force the speaker out and attack people, then you've crossed the line. You can boo, you can clap in some normal manner. So there is a gray area, but that is a very common view on campuses. I think there have been various studies. I think one of the Yale entities did a survey or hired a pollster to do that, and a shocking number of students believe that interrupting speakers who you think are hateful is appropriate, and shouting them down, and even using physical violence towards them. I mean, shocking percentages of students. I don't think it was a majority, but it was a plurality. I mean, it was 30, 40% of students. And that's because they have been taught that the most important thing is how you feel about what somebody is saying. And if what they are doing makes you uncomfortable, then their words, in the student's view, are violence. They are actually causing a physical impact on you. And that is a prevailing wisdom among a great number of students. And they don't hear an alternative view. And the alternative view is, well, what if I consider what you just said to be hurtful to me? Do I get to stop you from speaking? And if that's the measure, what you're doing is you're turning free speech into a power play. And on this campus, you may have the power to shut down other people's speech. But outside those gates, it's a different world. It's a world where Donald Trump was elected. It's a world where Republicans control the majority of legislatures. And if you are going to empower yourself to stifle speech on campus, then you have no right to object when you leave the campus and somebody stifles your speech. But they don't hear that perspective. All they know is that it makes them uncomfortable, and if it makes them uncomfortable, it's the equivalent of violence. And that's a prevailing wisdom. It didn't happen overnight. It's been a developing trend. And I tell a lot of people that the situation that we have on campuses with regard to this call out and cancel culture and a lot of other things was at least one, maybe two generations in the making. And it may be a generation in the unmaking. It's not going to happen overnight.
In the final count, isn't the attempt to defend the heckler's veto simply the latest version of the argument that might makes right?
That's exactly what it is. But a lot of students on college campuses, they have the might. They control the student government. They control the student organizations. They have mostly compliant or encouraging faculty and administrators. Of course, the faculty is forever on the campuses, and that's the continuity. And they have academic freedom. You can't tell them what to teach. And I think one of the most, as my Vassar speech indicates, and as I've seen some other groups do, providing alternative educational experiences for students is extremely important, because you cannot go to the faculty and tell them what to teach in their courses. You have to provide an alternative. And the faculty in most, of the high-profile universities, and when 2,000 higher educational institutions in the U.S., we're not talking about it every single place, but the problems tend to be at the very high-profile places, at the Oberlin colleges, at Yale, at places like that. And while it may, as a percentage of the nation, not be that huge, it has a disproportionate impact, because those are the campuses that get covered in the media, and those are the campuses from which future journalists graduate and future politicians. So I think that what's happened is that campus culture, while it's not at every single place, may not even be at a majority of the college campuses around the country, nonetheless has a disproportionate impact on the society and on the greater culture because of who it is that's being impacted. And that's why I think we've seen this call out and cancel culture migrate off of campus into the high-tech industry and the social media industry.
Based on your work, what are the issues that most affect free speech on campus?
I think it's these cultural issues that are hard to wrap around. The notion of hate speech, the notion of feeling safe on campus, not necessarily just a safe space, but feeling that it's an inclusive, everybody wants things to be inclusive, okay? But if the doctrine of inclusivity means anything that offends you it's no longer inclusive, it gets back to this might makes right. I mean, there's somebody, I forget who it was who said it, had a great tweet and said, I'm willing to ban hate speech as long as I get to decide what hate speech is. And that is, I think, the problem that we have. And so it's a cultural thing. There's no quick remedy to it. But I think there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of educational opportunities. One thing I've noticed, and it's purely anecdotal, but I've heard it from other conservative professors, is that I think there's a backlash building among students to the repressive culture, speech culture on campuses. And I've noticed it because it used to be my website was, the little secret on campus. I mean, they all read it, they all know about it, but students would never really talk to me about it. maybe at the end of the semester, they'd come up to me and they'd literally whisper, "I really like your website. My parents turned me on to it." And now, in the last couple of years, I've noticed they talk about it openly in front of other students without that fear. And other conservative professors have told me they found students more willing to do that, to express those views. And I think the whole podcast industry has had a big impact on that. An amazing number of students, I've had parents tell me that their kids listen to Ben Shapiro's podcast, and they can't believe it, and that is an alternative educational experience for people. It doesn't have to be a classroom on the campus. There are other ways to reach students that are having an impact. And I think that I sense that building, and we'll see where it goes.
You mentioned earlier that the war on free speech has begun to migrate off campus. Could you go into a little more detail about that?
Well, there have been a lot of examples with so-called deplatforming on social media, which is essentially trying to get people kicked off of social media, Facebook, Twitter, things like that. And it's anecdotal, it's hard to quantify it. We don't have access to Facebook's internal statistics or Twitter's internal operations, but it seems disproportionate that right-of-center groups are being deplatformed. We've experienced multiple times. Nobody said to you, well, we're pulling your YouTube channel because you're conservative. Instead, they have some cockamamie reason why it was pulled, and we were able to get publicity for it, so we got restored. Our Facebook page. One of the other websites that I run is something called ElizabethWarrenWiki.org, because we did so much research on her. We created a wiki site. Facebook just took down our page, but we were able to get publicity about it, and they restored us. Just a lot of anecdotal things. Prager University produces amazing videos. They've got millions of viewers, and their videos, or many of them, are restricted on YouTube. Is there any equivalent liberal group, what do they call them? Something Democrats. There's liberal groups who do that viral content and get millions of views on their videos. They don't get restricted. Why does PragerU? And so there's a lot of this anecdotal evidence. And then there's a very, very troubling trend that's coming of deplatforming people, not just from social media, but from the internet. And of course, it always starts with the worst of the worst, because nobody wants to defend the worst of the worst. So Stormfront, the neo-Nazi website, nobody wants to defend their content, but they were literally kicked off the internet. Cloudflare deplatformed them. Cloudflare is like a gatekeeper to the internet. They've been kicked off all social media, all hosting platforms. They finally found a server someplace in the middle of Europe or something like that to host them. And of course, nobody wants to defend their right to speech because of who they are, but it never stops there. And what you're going to see is if they can get them deplatformed from the internet, not just from Facebook or YouTube, it's going to move down the food chain, and you're going to see normal right-of-center groups who will be branded as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they will then use that hate group designation. I mean, Alliance Defending Freedom has had enormous success on religious freedom in the US Supreme Court. Okay? They've won case after case, yet they are branded a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Rand Paul and Ben Carson were once on the extremist lists. We broke that story at Legal Insurrection, and Southern Poverty Law Center, oh, that's a mistake. But it's not a mistake, because when Ben Carson and Rand Paul are being put on a list of extremists, you know they are not reserving these lists for the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis. Okay? And that's what happens. If you don't defend the worst people's right to speak, then it is a matter of time before it moves down. And I think that's where we're heading. We've seen it in attacks on advertisers. Media Matters has had a decades-long targeting of Fox News advertisers, of Rush Limbaugh advertisers. That's an attempt to deplatform them, because if you can deprive their radio stations of revenue, they're not going to carry the show. And if you can deprive Fox News of revenue, they're not going to carry that host. And so it's a very pernicious factor, and I think that's where we're going. And unfortunately, the high-tech industry is now populated by the students who were raised in this call-out and cancel culture. And they, just like they want to cancel the speech on campus for someone they consider offensive, now they want to kick them off the social media platform. Or they just do it, and if you're not like us who can get some publicity, it's amazing how quickly we got restored to Facebook when Fox News ran a story about us and called them for comment. But not everybody can do that. And so I think what's happened is this call out and cancel culture has moved into the mass culture through the high-tech companies, and I think that's a real problem.
Given the immense power of the high-tech industry, is there anything that could be done about this?
You know, as somebody whose website kind of started as part of the Tea Party movement, we never affiliated with a group, we're always for smaller government, not no government. That's the caricature that you get. Yo, you want no government. You know, who's going to bring the water to town? No, that's not what it is. But when given the choice between letting the market work it out, unless it's an emergency, we'd rather let the individuals make the decisions on how they're going to live rather than the government making it for them. And I think that's probably a philosophy that's common in this building. And so we try to let the market work. We try to empower individuals. So a lot of people are rushing towards the governmental intervention in the social media market. And I'm not saying there's no role for government in that, but I would be very, very cautious about that, because there's laws of unintended, consequences. It gets into a power play. Who is going to write the law in Congress? Well, it depends on which Congress you have. And so I think it's a problem. I'm not sure what can be done. I think in the short run, the best antidote for it, is sunshine, calling attention to what is going on. Because even mighty Facebook is responsive to a major media corporation calling them and asking for comment on why you closed this person's Facebook page. Politicians speaking out about it. So I would rather start, personally, now with sunlight being spread about what's happening and hoping they can reform themselves than some sort of trust-busting model of breaking up Facebook or breaking up. Because I got to tell you, I don't know where Facebook is going, but my kids don't use it. My kids are in their late 20s and early 30s. They use Snapchat and Instagram. Of course, Instagram is owned by Facebook. But things have a way of changing. These behemoths who we think are all-powerful may not be 5 years from now as alternatives arise. So I would rather shine a light on what's happening. I would rather have a public outcry. I would rather hope that they will be responsive. And if you're going to tell us you're just a neutral platform, and that's why you have these legal protections against lawsuits, because you're just a neutral platform, then live up to what you've promised us you are, rather than having the government write a 300-page bill that gets stuffed with all sorts of things in it you don't realize until afterwards or at the last minute. So I don't think government, I'm not in favor at the moment on any significant government intervention in the social media markets, but I do believe that if these companies are going to promise something, they should live up to it.
Moving forward, what do you see are the primary challenges to free speech in general in our culture?
Right, of course, when we talk about free speech, we're not only talking about the First Amendment. We're talking about it in a more popular notion. And I think social media and the internet is going to be the big bone of contention in the coming years. Because when I first started the website, there was a very vibrant, I'll call it conservative blogosphere, which has mostly been destroyed by Twitter. Because you could run your own website, get a few hundred people visiting a day, and it was a lot of work and a lot of effort, Instead, now you just go on Twitter, and if you say outrageous things, you'll get 20,000 followers, and it's very little work, and it's no cost. And we've probably lost several dozen of the websites we used to share links to and interact with each other over the past few years. And so I think that one of the problems is we've become so dependent on social media to get our message out there that social media can disappear. I mean, there were many conservative websites, or at least websites that touted themselves as conservative, which relied heavily on Facebook for their website traffic. Facebook changed the algorithm, and all of those conservative sites, along with BuzzFeed and a few on the liberal side, lost 80% of their traffic and folded. BuzzFeed didn't fold, but a lot of the conservative ones did. So I would say the challenges we face are continue to use social media. It's indispensable. It really is, the big platforms. But don't become so reliant on it that if it disappears, you've lost your ability to communicate. Continue to be involved face-to-face with people. Continue to maintain your email lists. Continue to maintain a plan B, a backup plan, a rainy day plan that will allow you to communicate with your audience and with your supporters and potential supporters away from the large social media platforms, because they may disappear one day and you just wake up. And when YouTube takes you down and Facebook takes you down, they don't write to you and say, here's why we're going to do it. What do you think? Okay. You just go to log in and they say your account's been disabled. That's it. There's no one to call. There's no one to write to. You're gone.
On the other hand, I ended my Facebook account months ago, but they won't close it.
Well, tell them you had me as a guest here. They'll close it.
On the Legal Insurrection website, you write much about the phenomenon known as intersectionality, which has become the mantra of the left. Would you explain to the audience what that means and how it affects life on campus and in the public sphere?
Intersectionality means a couple of different things. It, by the way, was developed as a theory by one of my law school classmates who went into academia right out of law school, whereas I went into private practice and accidentally ended up in academia. And I think there's a lesson there that you cannot understand oppression of an individual unless you understand the interlocking and intersecting oppressive forces that operate on them. So the way she developed the theory originally was that it's not enough to apply feminist theory to the oppression of black women, because black women have multiple forces of oppression working on them, both racial forces and gender forces. And therefore you've got to consider all of these interlocking systems of oppression. And that was a way of understanding employment discrimination law. But it has morphed over the years into a very politicized doctrine. So now there are intersecting systems of oppression that are taught on campuses, and they are not communism, and they are not totalitarianism. They are capitalism, and it's stepchild Zionism. And so what you get on campuses is an anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-Israel movement where they're all the same people, and they talk about these intersecting systems of oppression, and that's why they will say problems at the Mexican border are also Palestinian issues, okay? Because the border in Israel is just like the border in Mexico. But it's very driven by anti-capitalism. You have to understand that. Capitalism is their great Satan. And that's why it's taken hold on a lot of campuses, because for students who haven't been taught history, Mao is cool, Stalin is cool, because they're not taught about what these people did. And so you see that, and I see it even at Cornell, where they have literally a communist conference every year. And I'm not saying they shouldn't, but there's this watered down, filtered view of history. And so that drives a lot. But then there's a separate aspect of intersectionality, which was not part of what it originally was. And it's very much tied into identities. And there are hierarchies of victims. And the more of the victimized identities you have, the higher you are on the hierarchy. And that very much motivates students' attitude towards things. And it is the single dominant philosophy on campuses. Everything is intersectionality. The Vassar student government, the year before I showed up on campus, declared itself to be an intersectional feminist organization. This is the student government. The word is thrown around, and nobody really explores what it means, but it is the dominant culture on campuses.
Thank you. We're about to turn it over now for your questions, but before we do that, please join me in thanking Professor Gibbs. Questions? Yes, sir.
If y'all could wait till the microphone comes to you, please. Thank you.
I'm sorry, yes, the microphone will be coming over to you.
First of all, thank you very much for coming in. I actually started reading your website with Oberlin, so I'm a bit of a new arrival. I don't want this question to get too deep, so hopefully if you don't understand any of the terms I'm saying, ask, but I'll just assume that we do, or hope that we do. Once disparate impact sort of got into law, and it's sort of a statistical, you're guilty, and linear no threshold theory got into scientific regulation of, like, for instance, cancer and nuclear, I worry that there's going to be sort of a joining of them to say, and you sort of reference this, that hurtful words or hate speech makes somebody uncomfortable, which stresses them out, which the cortisol or the various stress hormones will have a negative impact on their health, and then therefore we can say that this is harmful and that you've actually hurt someone. And we have a lot of research on various groups that maybe they, as a group, their pregnancies are more difficult, or various health outcomes, and then they say this is from society being hurtful to them, or they have to endure hate speech, or various isms. And I wonder if you worry about this actually making it somehow into law, that the hate speech is not a First Amendment issue, but it's actually a harm that people are inflicting on each other. And I do worry that somehow there's going to be some legal mumbo jumbo that's going to pass through the courts. And I never would have thought that disparate impact, statistical impact, not personal impact, could become a legal standard, and the linear no threshold theory could actually become a basis for regulation, but it has. And I don't know if perhaps you have anything to say about this.
I'm not familiar with what linear no threshold is, but I think I understand the gist of your question, which is some of these social justice arguments will now make their way into law, and that the concept of things being making me physically ill, your words are making me physically ill, will somehow impact the First Amendment. I don't believe that's much of a threat, but I do think it emphasizes how important the courts are, because courts have come up with some things I never would have predicted they came up with. So, and that's why the Supreme Court is so important. I like to say trial judges are important, appellate judges are even more important, Supreme Court's even more important than all of them, but elections are the most important. And I think I can't say no judge will ever come up with such a ruling as you're talking about, but I think it's probably unlikely to happen.
Actually, let's go back. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, what's the future of affirmative action in light of the recent court decision on Harvard's admissions decisions, but particularly since you have an affiliation with Harvard?
Well, I have no affiliation with Harvard. I graduated there in 1984. I think it's my 35th reunion's coming up this weekend. I don't think I'm going to it. Not that I have anything against them. There's really nobody I want to see. I mean, the Harvard decision, I think, it may make its way up to the Supreme Court, and it may be the opportunity to revisit the enormous loophole that's been created in the anti-discrimination laws, which in plain English says it's okay to discriminate against people who you would not otherwise be able to discriminate against as long as there is some larger educational purpose that is served. I think it's very corrosive to the society to legitimize racism because it serves some bigger purpose, I think is extremely destructive. But I think that Harvard case is probably going to go up to the Supreme Court, and it may be the opportunity in 2 or 3 years to revisit this loophole that's been created. That university is a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. As long as you can couch discrimination in terms of serving some greater purpose on the campus, you can get away with it.
Jack?
I liked the Vassar story, and I'm sure it's out there somewhere that I can watch it because you said it was a 45-minute thing. But the thing I liked about it was that you talked about the hunger that these students apparently had and the dramatic effect that this 45-minute speech did. And so what I'm asking is, it seems to me that before they get into college, in high school, these young children, these students, should be educated in a way that it's not a huge surprise that they have to go to Vassar into a 45-minute pitch to get the real truth out. And if so, is there an agenda or a curriculum or a syllabus or something you would recommend for the high school people?
Yeah. There's nothing specific in that way, but I think your observation is absolutely correct, which is by the time students get to college, they have already essentially been indoctrinated since elementary school. And the answer to that is get involved in your school board, get involved in your parent-teacher association, do it on the local level. Just one little anecdote about, there's a girl in my neighborhood who graduated high school, great kid, athlete, not political at all. And she was over our house with her parents, and just in casual conversation, she drops the word patriarchy. And again, she's not political at all. And she's been taught in the schools about the patriarchy. And she just tossed it out and she didn't even, I think anything of it. And I think that people need to take back the educational system. It can't be done from above. You've got to spend the time. You know, when parents say, well, I sent my kids off to college and they came back and they were social justice warriors. I said, well, why'd you just divorce yourself from them for those 4 years when they're in college? I think the single greatest impact that I noticed, because since I am the advisor to almost every non-liberal group on campus, the students who are coming into Cornell who have those conservative principles, they have parents who were very involved and who made sure they got that education. If you're going to hand your kids off for 12 years to an educational establishment that uses Howard Zinn to teach history, what do you think is going to happen? So get involved.
This man's had his hand up for quite some time.
So another campus free speech issue is how the campus administrators put in free speech zones where kids are only allowed to pass out literature or talk about issues in a very tiny part of campus. And I know when students like libertarian groups and conservatives pass out the Constitution or the Bill of Rights elsewhere on campus, and they're shut down by campus police, and they sue, they win every time. And I'm wondering why campus administrators keep putting in these free speech zones.
I think campus administrators, in my experience, I think most of them are well-intentioned, most of them are good people, but they do seem to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And I think that it is problematic, and I think people need to shine a light on it. People need to challenge them. If you're banning students from handing out the Constitution, that's really bad optics for your campus. But it is a continuing problem, and it's amazing what a continuing problem it is. So I agree with you. It's baffling that despite losing these cases, they continue to do it.
Particularly in light of the judgment against Oberlin and the successful attempt at litigation against the Southern Poverty Commission, do you see a role for civil litigation in reining in a lot of abuses on campus?
Well, I think one place that it has had an impact, although I don't think it's in and of itself changed anything, are the campus sexual harassment and sexual abuse tribunals, where students are stripped of really due process rights, and the accusation becomes the evidence, not the evidence. And there have been a lot of lawsuits against schools, and they've lost a lot of them, and they've had to settle a lot of them. I don't think that's going to change it, but that's one area where I think it's been somewhat effective. I know there's a lawsuit that just got reinstated against the University of Michigan regarding their, I forget what they call it, bias response team. Now they changed the rules for the bias response team, but the lawsuit just got reinstated by the Court of Appeals. So I think there definitely is a role for litigation, but I always caution people, don't bring litigation for anything, but particularly in this area, just for the sake of bringing it. People really need to think through, because bringing a litigation challenging a practice and losing it is worse than having never brought the litigation at all. So I think people are sometimes a little quick and don't think strategically about it. But yes, I think there is a place where individual rights are being violated, or if state law is being violated or federal law is being violated, I think there absolutely is a place for civil litigation.
Thank you for coming. Do you have any personal advice for my 16-year-old son who is a lonely, conservative, patriotic capitalist at a very liberal high school where he's been physically threatened, physically attacked, lied about to be suspended, etc.?
Well, obviously I can't speak to his individual circumstance, but I think that people need support, and people need to support groups among students. And if you can't find those support groups at your high school or your college, then maybe you need to find it for your child off that campus. But I think this peer support is extremely, extremely important. That's why, again, my personal experience is at Cornell, and while conservatives are in the clear minority on campus, there is a fairly vibrant, small but vibrant conservative community where they find support from other students. Every year, 20 or 25 of them pack into cars and drive to the CPAC conference. They go to other conferences. They have their own subculture at Cornell, which allows them to thrive. And I think that you've got to find that for a child in high school. I think in high school it's probably more difficult than in college because it's so compact as opposed to a spread out college campus. So I think high school, but you've got to be an advocate for your child, which I'm sure you are, wherever they are, and you've got to get involved. And if it means pulling them out of that school district, then not everybody has the means to do that, so I understand that. But it's a battle. I mean, I've heard some really horrific stories about things that go on at the lower levels, pre-higher education levels in many school districts across the country.
On a related note, reflecting on your experiences, what advice do you have for young professionals in the tech industry who do not adhere to the progressive orthodoxy, and those of us who are politically involved and like to write essays for various libertarian and conservative publications? Should we keep our head down or stick true to our principles?
Well, I can't advise you on that, except I can, it's clear from your question, the potential consequences of using your real name and stepping forward. And that's, to me, an individual decision. I'm not going to lecture people that they should risk their job and their livelihood to speak out. I mean, I think that's, and I don't denigrate them if they choose not to. I understand it completely. For me, like I said, it was ignorance. I didn't know I could use a pseudonym. It never dawned on me. And also, academia is not my first career. And if they were to have fired me in response to those demands, I would have done something else. But not everybody else is in that position. So I think that's an individual decision, and I can't tell somebody what they should or shouldn't do. I would just say, just be realistic about what it could mean, because we've heard some horror stories in the high-tech industry about people who do step out and do vocalize it. And I would say just, think it through and decide what's right for you. But I would never pressure somebody to do that, because the impact can be too great on their life if they lose their job.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hi.
I went to a highly rated college that now has no conservative faculty or administrators or board members on the board of trustees or whatever. I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on how important it is to have at least one conservative professor for students who are inclined to rally around and give some legitimacy to their views.
Well, I think it's extremely important, and that's why I value my role on campus, because while there are a couple of other people they can go to, for the most part, they turn to me because they need that affirmation, they need that institutional support. And I think that's extremely important. And if a college is not providing that, then they're ignoring a significant portion, and they're simply reinforcing this peer culture of silencing certain voices. So I think it's extremely important. I think it's extremely important that faculty step forward. But it is what it is, and it's not going to change overnight. I mean, in the college I went to is a perfect example. I went to Hamilton College. It was at the time a fairly conservative, a little bit stodgy sort of all-male school. We had a sister school, which is a fairly radical, formed in the 60s, Kirkland College. And we shared a campus. And Kirkland went out of business, and Hamilton absorbed it because we didn't want an empty campus next to us. So Hamilton went co-ed and absorbed the Kirkland faculty, the radical Kirkland faculty. Over the course of 20 years, the radical Kirkland faculty took over all the committees and took over the faculty. And now Hamilton is indistinguishable in many ways from Oberlin College. And I think that's happened a lot of places. I'd love to be able to say we can reverse that overnight, but you can't. And so I think you need to raise with administrators why there is not institutional support for conservative students.
Yes, sir.
Yes, having gone through the ROTC program at my college, do you find that the ROTC program provides a bastion, a harbor for the conservatives on your campuses?
I can't really speak to that. I mean, Cornell actually has a fairly sizable ROTC program for the undergraduates, and I just have no interaction with them. But at least on the surface, you would think that that would provide another community where students can feel comfortable, and I think that's important.
We have 4 minutes left for questions. Over here? Yes, I'm sorry. This man hadn't gone yet, so my apologies, sir.
You mentioned that you see the beginnings of a backlash growing, and I wonder, considering that a lot of these controversies have to do with how we define words like fascist or violence, what about the word liberal? Do you think maybe it's time to stop using the word liberal for people who seem to have no understanding or respect for the core tenets of liberalism in the Enlightenment sense?
Well, liberal is becoming something of a dirty word on campuses. It's not radical enough. Okay, it's too establishment. And so to be called a liberal on campus is generally not a compliment when it's coming from more progressive students. So they call themselves progressive or socialist. And so, yes, I mean, I agree in many ways. I consider myself an old-fashioned liberal, which is individual rights, keeping the government off my back. I mean, when I was growing up, those were, at least at one level, liberal principles. Whereas now, liberalism as a political matter has come to mean using the power of the government to force people to do things that you want them to do, which is the opposite of, so a lot of things have changed in the last 2-3 decades, including what it means to be conservative. So those phrases are all going through a transformation, but I agree with you that liberal does not mean what on campus what you and I might have thought it meant.
Yeah, time for one last question. You've had your hand up for a while there.
Yeah, thank you. Are you aware of any campuses that would be a good example of free speech and what that would look like?
I'm going to think about this. I'm sure there are, but it's part of the nature of covering things that you tend to focus on the places there are problems. When, nobody reports in the news, I woke up today and felt great. That's not news. I woke up today and felt horrible, somebody insulted me, somebody called me a name, that's potentially news. So I think there are, I'm sure there are. I'd like to think that Cornell has improved a lot. It's just that we tend not to focus on it. We tend to focus on the problems. And maybe there's something to be a lesson there, which is that by only focusing on the problems, maybe we're hiding part of the truth, which is that in many places there is a vibrant, campus free speech culture. But there are enough problems to keep me busy and to keep a lot of people busy.
That was our last question. Please join me again in thanking Professor Jacobson.